Hello, Amparo. Welcome so much to the Soul Aligned Self-Care Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I'm great. As I
Good.
said, the sun is out, so I'm happy. So to get started, if you could just let the listeners know, what you do for a living and tell us a little bit about your journey so we know how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, happy to share. So, hi everyone. My name is Amparo. I'm the founder of Azteca. By way of coaching and meditations and workbooks, I help women to reclaim their feeling of worthiness, their feeling of joy, their feeling of badassery after experiencing hardship, whether that's workplace toxicity, relational abuse. There's so much, so many different forms of toxicity.
Yeah.
Um, and help them to reclaim sort of that fire that often gets dimmed during the experience of hardship so that they can come back into themselves and step into the world as a force of nature. So that's what I do.
I love that. Very similar to what I do. And tell me about your journey. Like, how did you get to where you are today? Did you transition from a different career? Um,
Yeah, well, that's the case for so many of us, right?
yeah.
Yeah, so I'm a woman of color who grew up in an impoverished neighborhood. I grew up in South Central LA. So I had an early foundation in dealing with a lot of very heavy life challenges. But I'm also very service oriented. So because of my upbringing, my culture, my personality, I've always been someone who's taken whatever hardship I've gone through and immediately turned it into something to help someone else.
Mm.
Uh, and so from that foundation, I went off. I got a chance to see a little bit of the world, sort of refine my understanding of things. And then I also entered into an abusive relationship later on with a covert narcissist. Developed brain damage during that experience, brain trauma, lost my identity, lost everything that I now want to help other people to reclaim. So that's where Azteca came from, that I was completely broken during that experience. The hardship that I experienced as an adult was 10 times greater than what I experienced growing up. And so, in reclaiming those things within myself, I wanted other people to have that experience as well. I think that there are a lot of beliefs that are circulating in the social fabric that make it so that people sort of assume that you can't get these things back, that it's too
Mhm.
hard, that it's impossible, that if you're dealing with very severe trauma, that's it, that's the rest of your life. And no, that's not how it has to be. And so because I'm so service oriented, I'm someone who gets a lot of joy from seeing other people experience joy. I want the world to heal. I want other people to get back those parts of themselves. I want them to realize life doesn't have to get just awful as you grow older in this life, and that's just how it has to be, you know?
Yeah, I agree with you 100% that you can definitely heal. You could definitely reclaim your fire, as you said. I love that term. That's beautiful. And I don't, I think it's really sad that people actually think that they have to just sit there and suffer for the rest of their lives. And
Yeah.
the more we can get this word out and help more women heal, people heal, the better the world will be, right? So,
Yeah.
but you said a few things that were really interesting to me. Um, well, first you said that you saw the world, and it's one of the things that I've noticed when a lot of people go through this transition, they seem to like travel a little bit. It's like a common denominator. I went to, so there was one man I talked to that was like, I went to India, and then the other woman was like, I went to Mexico, and I did this. It's very, very interesting stories.
Yeah.
So just on a just out of curiosity, I'm wondering where you went.
Yeah, so as a student, and I want to lay out the context. The
Okay.
context is I grew up in poverty in a very dangerous neighborhood where I couldn't even explore my block.
Mm,
So my world growing up was extremely limited, and but I grew up watching TV shows that showed me a taste of the world. So that's where that desire came from. So
hmm.
college, I studied abroad. I went to Chile,
Oh,
and from there
nice.
I traveled to Argentina, I went to Uruguay, I went to Peru, I went to Brazil. So that
Oh,
was my
wow.
very that was sorry, and I also went to Mexico a couple years before that. So, and I'm Mexican American, but I hadn't gone past the age of two until that point in time. I was about 18 as a production assistant for a great documentary.
Hmm.
So I got all these experiences of getting a chance to travel around pretty much just Latin America during
Yeah.
college. And then afterwards, I went to Hawaii, which even though it's part of the US, it's far away. It's a distinct culture, very
Hmm.
beautiful culture. I went to Japan, I went to Sweden, so I got some
Wow, you went
really cool
everywhere.
experiences. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
some really cool experiences. A lot of stamps on my passport, but a lot more that remain.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
oh, that sounds like so much fun.
yeah,
And then you also said that you were in a relationship with a narcissist and yeah, been there with you.
yeah.
And but you said you had you received brain damage. You
Brain
suffered from
trauma.
brain trauma. So
Yeah.
I'm very curious, did you actually have like physical brain trauma, or was the brain trauma from the narcissism? Because I know that that causes brain damage.
Yeah, so sorry, can you clarify your question if I had physical brain
Yeah,
trauma?
I was just wondering if you were referring to the brain damage, because a lot of people aren't familiar that with the fact that narcissism, being
Yeah,
in that type of relationship, causes brain
yes.
damage. But did
Yeah.
you also receive like physical brain trauma?
Oh, no. So
Okay.
it was covert narcissism. So
Okay. Oh,
my
yeah,
yeah.
I would like you to explain that because I know that myself.
Yeah.
I don't even like looking at it because I spent so long in that relationship.
Yeah.
But can you explain that to the people, the listeners, so that they know?
Yeah, so the vast majority of people think abuse is just one thing, right? They think that it's one person hitting another person. They think it's usually a man hitting a woman, and that's abuse. It's a very limited definition for abuse. So
Hmm.
abuse is very broad, and it includes psychological abuse, it includes emotional abuse, it includes verbal abuse, it includes sexual abuse. There are so many components to the world of abuse itself. And
Hmm.
then you have the additional layer of whether this person is um, driven by something that's part of their makeup. So something like narcissism or something else, something that's a personality disorder or related to something that's specific to their personality that can drive them to be motivated to manipulate. It could be very embedded within their motivational scheme to harm.
Hmm.
Within that, I know I'm giving a very complicated answer, but within that, there are different categories of how that abuse may play out. And
Hmm.
so it can be so there's four different categories: overt, covert, altruistic, and malignant. So malignant is the one that's most obvious, someone yelling at you in your face in a grocery store kind of thing. Altruistic is the hardest to detect because it's the head of NGOs who seems to be, or a spiritual leader who seems to be doing a lot of good. But the closer that you get to that person, the more that they're gaslighting you and manipulating you and psychologically torturing you.
Hmm.
Then there's overt covert. So overt isn't as obvious as malignant, but it's still obvious. They still sort of they don't have the motivation of wearing a significantly different mask than someone who is covert, because they have more power in the world than someone who is covert, for example,
Hmm.
often. Someone who is covert will be very sweet and loving to their partner in public. They'll share all sorts of great things about them on social media, for example. But behind closed doors, they're criticizing them, they're putting them down, they're yelling at them, they're causing fights, they're depriving them of basic care, they're blaming them for everything, they're gaslighting them. And these are all things that people don't understand how violent they are. It's very
Hmm.
much death by a thousand cuts. It's death by a thousand cuts.
Yeah, I agree
So
with you.
gaslighting, which is a form of mental abuse, it erodes your mental state over time. So I was gaslit to the point of experiencing losing my mind. I know what it's like to feel like you're losing your mind because you no longer know what reality is. You can't trust your eyes, you can't trust your ears, you can't make sense of your own thoughts, let alone of reality. So they're very violent forms of
Hmm.
elongated harm.
Yeah, and it's something that people don't really notice because, as you said, in public, they're very sweet and
Yeah,
usually very charming, very charming.
yeah.
And yeah, I when I was in that relationship, I was in that relationship for 20 years. And so it was extremely difficult to get out of that relationship. And I would say the only reason I was able to do that was for my children. Like if it wasn't for my children, I probably, because as you said, you lose your mind, and you lose your confidence, you lose your self-worth, and you lose the connection with yourself. You
Yes.
don't even trust yourself anymore. And
Yes.
yeah, so it's like re like reversing all of that damage. And I didn't know until recently that that actually causes brain damage.
Yeah.
And as I said, I don't even want to, like, I've never really gone deep into it because it's almost like I just don't want to know. Like, just,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's because it's
Yeah.
scary.
Yeah.
And I've been out of that relationship for a really long time. And I would say the whole time that I've been out of that relationship, I've been working to heal and to recover. And it took a while. It does take a while. But um, I would say the way I would describe it, and maybe you could let me know what you think, is that even from the beginning, the once you make the decision to um, get out of that relationship and start to heal, that you feel significantly so much better that you don't even realize the long haul that's in front of you, because you feel so much better instantaneously. And you don't recognize the amount of work and time that it takes until you're looking back,
Yeah.
in hindsight, and you're like, wow, that took a long time. But while you were going through it, it felt so good. The more and more that you heal, the better that you feel. Would you agree with
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a really horrendous awakening experience. I didn't know because it was so covert
Mm-hmm.
and he was so manipulative and presented a very distinct face, right? And my own suppressive tactics, my own like need to believe that this person genuinely cared about me. I didn't know I was being abused, even though I was rescued. So I was
Mm-hmm.
rescued, and then after I was rescued is when my suppressive tactics collapsed and I had all these repressed memories come to the surface of my psyche. And for weeks, I was a complete and total and utter just broken mess
Mm-hmm.
because my mind was making sense of reality. So for about 6 to 8 weeks, I was a blob. I was screaming. I felt animalistic. I didn't feel human. And it took a while to get back my humanity, but during that period of time, especially, it was very pronounced. And then I had this experience of feeling like I came back into my body. I looked in the mirror and I saw myself again for the first time in years. It's like I recognized myself again.
Mm-hmm.
I had stopped disassociating. It felt like I had been a flower that had been wilting that sort of popped back to life. So that was a point for me that you were describing of like suddenly I felt really, really good. And I'm like, wow, I got gotten back all these things that I had no idea that I could get back. No idea.
Yeah.
The journey that was ahead of me because I had PTSD and CPTSD at that point. For anyone that doesn't know, there's PTSD that typically arises from a single traumatizing experience, something like a car crash, for example, or someone being abusive to you once. And then there's CPTSD, complex PTSD, that arises from an extended period of traumatizing experiences. So CPTSD is like the nastier cousin of PTSD. I had both.
Mm-hmm.
Had many forms of PTSD and CPTSD. So I had a huge journey up ahead and existed in this world that forces you to have to work unless you come from a very small segment of society, forces you to have to work to survive. While I was dealing with brain damage, where I couldn't make basic decisions, I couldn't formulate my own thoughts, I couldn't,
Mm-hmm.
like, I couldn't even do basic things like understand that my needs were okay. How do you function as a human being when you don't understand that your needs are okay, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it was a journey to rebuild myself. And all along the way, I kept thinking because very logical person. So it's like I've healed myself from other things. It was never this bad. But I've healed myself from other things in the past. And the way that this has worked in the past and the way that I imagine that it'll work now is this sucks, but it's less awful than what I just came from. And I'll
Mm-hmm.
keep approaching it that way. This sucks. It sucks a little bit less than what I
Mm-hmm.
just came from.
Yeah.
And I kept going and used my experience to help other people along the way because I thought this is no way for me to live. This is not living. And I know how rampant this is. I'm very aware of how rampant this is.
Oh my God,
Society makes
yes.
it so hard first of all, society enables us to be easy victims,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Movies
We're
and
raised that way.
songs and yeah, and then there's cultural elements on top of that. And so I thought, man, like there's so many forces that make it so that people get and wrapped into this very easily that make it really hard to understand that what you're living is harmful. You know, we have things like these assumptions that marriage just inherently gets hard over time and you just have to put up with things. No,
Hmm. Yeah.
no.
I know.
And then it makes it hard to escape on top of the chamber of brainwash that you're in, because that's what that experience is like. It's very much a chamber of brainwash. The further you go into the experience, the further and dimmer and smaller the light becomes, right? The light of recognition of what you're living and who you are. And then there's very little support to heal. There's very little support to come out of it, especially when you're in such a deeply broken state, because if you're inside of a relationship with a narcissist, they break you down across the entire board,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
across the board, emotionally,
Yep.
mentally, financially, spiritually, everything, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so when you
Yeah.
mention financially, it's, they cut you off from your family sometimes.
Yeah.
But financially also, so when I was, raising my kids and in this relationship, I wasn't working. And so there was like no hope, no way
Yeah.
for me to get help,
Yes.
and I was not I'm very close with my family, but like physically, I was not close enough to my family to get the support and to um, kind of also notice how far away from being myself that I was. There was no one there to remind me of who I was, and you talk about also when you said, yeah, you don't even know how to take care of yourself or basic human needs. Like it reminds me of this one thing that I always share after I was out of the relationship, still when I was still healing, I just wasn't able to calm my nervous system and come out of that fight or flight. And I remember getting exhausted to the point where my body would just
Yes.
shake. Like it would
Yes.
just shake. And I was like, why is my body shaking? I just thought I was dying. Like, why? And then slowly I figured out, I was like, oh, I'm exhausted. Right. So it like just those little things that people take for granted of just knowing I'm tired, I should rest. I couldn't even recognize that anymore because
Yes.
I always had to be on and in that protection
Yes.
slash people pleasing mode, so
Yeah.
there's so many little things. I like how you described it earlier. It's the death by a
Death
thousand
by a
cuts or
thousand
whatever you
cuts.
said. It's almost the same way when you're coming out of it. Like there's all these like little things that you have to undo
Yeah.
and you don't notice it until it like makes itself apparent and you're healed enough to start noticing those things. It's crazy.
Yeah, yeah. Because what they did was they rewired your brain in a very, very harmful way. So your brain came to associate very benign things like having needs, having confidence, being in a bedroom with
Mm-hmm.
danger. And not just a little bit of danger, a lot of bit of danger, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because typically this abuser is a person that you allowed them into your subconscious because you trusted them. So they have the most access to the most tender parts of you than most anyone else in the world, and they do the most damage
Mm-hmm.
as a result of that, right? So your brain gets so mixed up with all this sort of rewiring. Actually, I run a group program and I just talked about the brain with them this past Sunday, which is great. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I talked with them about was this experiment that I heard about a long time ago that was so important for me to have heard about then so that I could understand what happened to me
Mm-hmm.
post abuse and heal more intentionally and to understand that I could heal more intentionally. So it's the baby Albert experiment.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of details that I don't know, but I know enough. So
Yeah.
the baby Albert experiment was a experiment that was conducted decades ago when it was still permissible to do psychological experiments on human children. And the researchers wanted to see if they could get the baby to pair flipping of a switch of a light with a harsh stimulus. So they left a baby in the room, and every time that they would go into the room, they would turn on the light switch and then they'd make a very loud, abrupt sound next to
Mm-hmm.
the baby. The baby would wince every time, right? Eventually, what they did was they would flip on the switch without making the loud sound, but the baby would still flinch. Why? Because the brain is wired for survival.
Mm-hmm.
So what it does is it creates associations so that you can very quickly learn what is safe and not safe in your environment. What do things mean, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how your brain is set up for the rest of your life. It is always trying to learn. It's always trying to keep you alive. And so during the experience of abuse, your brain notices, wow, I was calm, and then this person went ballistic on me.
Mm-hmm.
Or I asked for my needs, and this person shamed me. Your brain comes to associate those things. I was in my bedroom, and this
Mm-hmm.
person came in and they started harassing me.
Mm-hmm.
It starts to create those associations. So I, when I say I was a jumbled mess, I mean that in the most horrific way possible. Existing at night caused panic for me
Mm-hmm.
because the vast majority of the abuse that I lived took place at night. So my brain came to associate nighttime with awful abuse, like
Yeah.
all forms of abuse, including a lot of lack of sexual consent. And so my existence was really rough for a period of time because my brain had come to associate connection, touch, conversation, opening up, having needs, even being outside of my home and having a need. I was shamed a lot for needing to have something, water or something outside of
Yeah.
the home. So there were so many things that would cause panic inside of me. Which is why I didn't feel like a human being until very recently. I would say
Mm-hmm.
that I got my first taste of feeling human again in like 2022 is when I first started to feel it again. And
Mm-hmm.
that was a couple of years after escaping. So this is what happens to the brain, and it's understandable because your brain is wired to survive. And at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, if you can understand this, then you can understand that the solution to this, one part of the solution is exposure therapy, because
Mm-hmm.
you have to rewire your brain to help it to understand, to remember. It's okay, these things don't have to be associated with abuse anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
can have needs, you can have connection, you can exist in these different spaces, you can be in this room, you can do these things.
Mm-hmm.
And these awful things that happened to you in the past, they won't happen to you again. And
Yeah.
so that was one of the things that I did was very intentional about going through exposure therapy for myself and giving myself ample time and space to reflect and rebuild my entire internal infrastructure to just exist in the world. And
Mm-hmm.
it was bad,
Yeah.
really rough. And again, because I'm so service oriented, that's why I thought I need to turn this into something. I need to help more people understand that cause and effect. If you can understand cause and effect, you can stop, you can sort of peel off layers of shame of I did something wrong. I did
Mm-hmm.
something bad. I deserved this. I don't understand what is happening to me. I don't understand what happened to me. And peel off the layers of this is how it's always going to be. I will never be able to get myself back. It's
Mm-hmm.
gonna keep going downhill from here. No.
No. Yeah. And you see the behaviors, like I see the behaviors in a lot of the people that I work with where they're always apologizing for everything. Just having, they apologize for having a basic need. Like, oh, like for example, you're driving along in the car with your friend and they're like, can you stop? I have to go to the bathroom. I'm so sorry. I'm so, like over apologizing, or
Yeah.
they need a drink and you have to stop with what you're doing because they
Yes.
need a drink, or that
Yes.
those behaviors are just kind of like survival. And it's
Yeah.
about, so it's about I think one of the most powerful practices that really helped me, there were two that really, really stand out. And one of them is learning how to set and maintain boundaries,
Yeah.
which took a while to
Yeah.
really learn how to do that without feeling uncomfortable. You know what I mean? It was very uncomfortable at first. And then the second thing was just reframing different situations, taking the time that I need to be able to respond to a situation instead of react. Because when I
Yeah.
was in that relationship, I was so reactive to everything. And so, one of the things I always repeat to my clients is you're allowed to pause. You're allowed to pause and decide how you want to react. You don't like
Yes.
respond. You don't have to react. You could just
Yes.
say stop, and you're allowed to say that. You're allowed to do that. And if someone's not allowing you to do that, then that's a little bit of a red flag.
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
intentional,
Yes,
you know.
yes, yeah. So
So
a
to
few,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
sorry, I just wanted to jump in and say a few things. So one is I like to help people understand why it's uncomfortable. Why when you tell them something like you're allowed to do this, they
Mm-hmm.
feel this visceral, strong gut, almost nauseous reaction, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's because of the pairing of things within your subconscious, right?
Yeah.
So I use logic and understanding of how things work within them and around them to help people to understand this is cause and effect. You don't have to feel bad that this is how you respond, because the experience of abuse, whether it's individual or systemic abuse, causes predictable, repeatable forms of impact
Mm-hmm.
and harm. It's like same tactics, same impact across the board. And so, one of my taglines for the work that I do is helping women come out of feeling small, silent, and second guessing themselves, because that is how you feel. That's how you survive during abuse. You
Yes.
make yourself really small, so you're over apologizing all the time for needing something, right?
Mm-hmm.
You silence yourself, so you get to the point where you suppress your needs, you suppress your insights, you suppress your desires. You have moments of explosion all the time because you're dysregulated within it and
Mm-hmm.
you're being triggered all the time, right? And then second guessing yourself, natural result of
Yeah.
gaslighting, natural result of gaslighting. So if I can help people to understand A plus B equals C, it's just an equation. It's how it
Mm-hmm.
is. And because it's an equation, it's how it is, it's how it happens all the time. Then also we can create a similar equation when it comes to healing
Mm-hmm.
so that you can understand it, pull out the poison, pull out the brainwash, and know that as you do these things, as you set boundaries, as you experience moments of confidence, it's going to feel deeply uncomfortable because
Yes.
your subconscious associates it with danger.
Mm-hmm.
It's the craziest thing, right? That your brain associates these really good things with bad things, but it's true. That's
Yeah.
how it works.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing wrong with you. That's
Yeah.
how it works. So if you can understand that that's a natural outcome, that is what you're going to experience at first, it doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It doesn't mean that you're doing a bad thing. It doesn't mean that boundaries are bad. It doesn't mean that you're hurting people, which is what you've been taught by your abusers, what you've been taught by abusive systems, is that
Mm-hmm.
if you have boundaries, it means that you're hurting them. And since you as a target is often someone who is a very kind, caring, considerate person, you don't want to hurt people. So it
Mm-hmm.
really affects you when you think that you're hurting someone, which is why you reduce all of your boundaries, right? You can
Yeah.
understand, oh, this is what I can expect. And the more that I do this through exposure therapy, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
how exposure therapy works. It's that at first you have a really strong reaction, and then it's smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. You know what to expect.
Yeah, yeah. And then you just become so comfortable with it. Like now I set boundaries naturally. I'm not thinking about it. When I first started, I had a system that I had to use, like steps I
Yes.
had to go through because I didn't know how to do it. And also I remember, this was a long time ago, but when I first started setting boundaries, I was so uncomfortable with it that I would
Yes.
almost be a little bit confrontational about it because it was so hard for me to get,
Yeah.
well, I feel this way and I'm doing it this way and that's that. Like, this is my boundary. So, so I just remember that's how it started. But then, now it's just something that's set
Yes.
and I don't question it. And if somebody else questions it, I'm like, that's fine. You don't
Yes.
like if you don't agree with that, that's fine. Then you're not meant to be in my life. And that's the way it is.
Yes.
So
Yes.
in
Absolutely.
addition to this stuff that we're talking about right now, what are some of the steps that you took to help heal yourself and the steps that you take
Yeah.
take to help heal other women too?
Man, that's a good question. It was such a moment by moment experience for me at first.
Hmm.
And so what I did at first was I spent a lot of time processing.
Hmm.
So I gave myself ample time to write everything down because everything was pouring out of me. I was rewriting my entire understanding of what I had lived during that experience, but also of my entire life. I had repressed memories coming to the surface of even before I had visual memory. So it was like a felt memory from childhood abuse. So I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, or typed and I typed and I typed onto online journals. I walked every day for, I kid you not, 3 to 4 hours every
Hmm.
day, just processing, getting it out. And I needed this because I had suppressed so much that I needed an outlet. I
Mm-hmm.
needed to give myself time to process. And what happens to you during the experience of abuse, again, whether it's individual or systemic abuse, is whenever you're doing things that are good for you, they sabotage it somehow. They make you feel guilty, they shame you, they disrupt you, they cause an argument, something, right? So who you were before or in between instances of abuse, which is who you really are, you and
Mm-hmm.
safety is who you really are, is
Mm-hmm.
a very different person who has access to tools that are helpful for her or him versus the person that you become during the experience of elongated abuse because you stop doing those things because they disrupt it. Your subconscious can tell when I meditate, something bad happens.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm kind to myself, something bad happens. When I take time to myself, something bad happens. When I set a boundary, something bad happens. So you stop doing those things. So at first, I didn't have access to any of it.
Mm-hmm.
I could tell the difference, and it made me horribly sad that I had gone from this person who was meditating and jolly, jolly, a very happy person.
Yeah.
And I felt so horribly broken and I didn't have access to anything. But I'm very stubborn and I'm very resilient, as all survivors are, in my estimation.
Mm-hmm.
So I kept thinking, okay, I can't do this. What else can I fucking do to
Yeah.
help myself get myself back? I can tell that my mind can't handle doing these things, and I have a theory of why. So, what are some other things that I can do that I don't have a negative association with because I didn't use them during
Mm-hmm.
the experience? This is how we are.
Yeah.
We're strategic, we're survivalistic. It's who we are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I did. I walked, I reflected a lot, I gave myself ample time, I researched a lot what I had lived so that I could have a framing for it. And then I started to research PTSD and CPTSD so that I could understand what I was doing there. And eventually I started to get more tools back. Eventually I was able to meditate again. Eventually I was able to get back into Qigong. Eventually I was able to get back into testing out energy healing again.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually I was able to get back connection with people. And that was a doozy, was getting back the ability to be connected with people.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. That's really hard.
Yeah.
Especially like for me, it was especially with men, so that was really hard. Something you said that really just like connected in my head was how you said you couldn't do certain practices. And I always talk to people and I'm like, yeah, what works for one person doesn't always work for the next person. And I never thought, never made the connection before, but that's possibly why it doesn't always work, all these
Yeah.
different practices.
Yeah.
Certain things resonate with certain people. And then some people are just like, no, that just doesn't work for me. So that's an
Yeah.
interesting thing to explore when you're looking at different practices that you're going to use to heal yourself.
Yeah.
Now, if you could just share a little bit about systemic,
Yeah.
um, you know, like if you could maybe share with people what that means and how it
Yeah.
affects people, that would be
Absolutely.
great.
So one of the horrendous things that I realized after coming out of abuse, because I'm highly analytical. So
Hmm.
again, just for context, I'm a woman of color who grew up in the hood, who went on
Hmm.
to become very highly educated. So I had the combination of street smarts and street view with scholastic, right,
Hmm.
researched background. I realized that just existing as a person in society mirrored the experience of being a person in an abusive family system. So, abusive family systems have these, again, very predictable constructs. Every person has a role and they have to abide by that role. And if they don't abide by that role, they're horribly shamed, if not ostracized. And the treatment that that person receives within that family is dependent on their role. And your needs are only met if your needs happen to coincide with the needs of the people in power, right? So there
Hmm.
were so many things that I started to realize, wow, it's exactly in a abusive family system, children are pitted against each other,
Hmm.
right? You
Yeah.
don't see each other as humans, you see each other as competition for care, for love, for affection, for recognition, for your basic needs, right?
Hmm.
Your family is driven by an experience of competition, by what's going to keep me alive,
Hmm.
physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. It's driven by uh a hierarchical pyramid type of thing of you really don't want to be here. You don't want to be on mom and dad's bad side because
Hmm.
really bad things can happen to you, right? Versus the golden child up
Yeah.
top who receives the best experience, right?
Hmm.
In an abusive family system, often as well, you're not taught this. You're not taught, hey, you're experiencing this type of behavior because of this structure.
Yeah.
And it's not because it's who you are, it's because of the structure, right? So children within an abusive family system, they can internalize that. I'm receiving the worst form of harm because I'm a bad person. I'm receiving the best form of care because I'm a good person. I deserve it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the structure. It's not about deservability. That's where our like severe worthiness issues come from. We internalize this stuff. It's
Hmm.
not because of who you are. It's because of these structures, right?
Yeah.
And so I realized that really obvious things like racism, sexism, classism, ableism, those are all extremely harmful and they abide by the same sort of tactics and tools and impact that one experiences in abusive family systems. But it's those are sort of the equivalent of like malignant overt narcissism where it's really obvious.
Hmm.
Then there's also existing as a person in school it can have very similar tendons as well. I don't know if tendons is the right word.
Yeah, I
It's
know what
like
you mean.
if, for example, I started to wonder, okay, if there are these so many similarities between the way that society is currently constructed in an abusive family system, what would society look like if it mirrored more the principles of a healthy family system?
Hmm.
Healthy family system, children are not pitted against each other. It is not driven by competition,
Hmm.
not in competition with each other, right? It's driven by cooperation. In a healthy family system, if one person needs help, they receive that help. They're not shamed for that help, right? The family sort of comes together and whoever is best able to help that person, that's what happens, right?
Yeah.
There's more of an experience of compassion, of love. You experience that so much more in a
Hmm.
healthy family system, right? Siblings try to understand each other. Parents try to understand children. There isn't a listen to me or else. There isn't
Hmm.
I know best, and so we're gonna do this because you are insignificant and you don't understand what you're doing. It's input from everybody is acknowledged and validated, right? There isn't things like future faking and breadcrumbing. We get gaslit all the time by our systems, right? There's a
Hmm.
lot of gaslighting that's going on right now
Oh my
on
God. Yeah.
huge scale, right?
Yeah.
But then these other tactics are there too, minimizing, invalidation, breadcrumbing, future
Yes.
faking. You experience that on a systemic level and you get used to it. So what happens in an individual instance of abuse? Why does breadcrumbing work? Because it's in combination with these other tactics of love bombing. So
Hmm.
another example that I like to share. Think about the experience of coming into a new workplace.
Hmm.
What is the average person's experience? Very often high satisfaction at the very beginning.
Yeah.
You are being welcomed in. There's some sort of positive onboarding experience. If you're lucky, there's some sort of positive onboarding experience. But then that often trails off over time. And we just sort of accept that that's how it has to be, just like we accept that marriages are, that that's how they have to be, that life has to be this way. Really great at the beginning, and this,
Yeah.
oh no, I challenge all of this. I don't
Hmm.
accept this ridiculous idea that things have to get worse over time. That's so ridiculous. That's lazy reasoning.
Yeah.
It's lazy. Why don't we challenge this?
Yeah.
So when we think about the average experience that someone has going into workplace, it's like an abusive relationship. Love bombing at the very beginning, right? To lure you in. You're exactly what we've been looking for. You're a rarity amongst this population. You got this like scarce thing that you're the perfect person for.
Yeah.
And then gradual reduction of care,
Hmm.
gradual training to silence anything
Hmm.
that is oppositional
Oh, it's so
to
true.
that workplace, right? And
Yeah, it's so,
oh, the whole promotion thing and being led by what other people care about you because how your perception according to other people's standards is what you should care about. There's just so much about the work experience by itself that
mhm.
mirrors an abusive relationship.
Oh my God. Yeah. And it's the perfect example of um, the example that you gave before that. It's just the perfect example to be able to look at it on different scales and in different situations. I just love it. It really makes sense, and it makes it much easier to understand.
Yes.
Really, I feel like it makes
Yes.
it so much easier to understand. Oh my God, we could probably have a whole podcast about that, a whole nother episode, because that's just
We
such a
will talk
great
about that.
topic. If you could just share though, how can people connect with you? Where do you hang out?
Yeah.
What's the best
Yeah.
way to find you?
Well, in the world. Just kidding.
Yeah.
So yeah, so they can go to my website, azteca.com,
Okay.
ASTEKAH.com. I'm on Instagram at Azteca underscore. They
Okay.
can reach out to me via email, amparo at azteca.com, AMPARO at ASTEKAH.com. I also have a free gift for anyone that listens to your podcast episode, so they can go to azteca.com/podcast/gift, and there's a free meditation there
Awesome.
on getting comfortable with the idea of quote unquote mistakes. It's another thing that I realized is a similarity between being a person in an abusive relationship and being a person in society
Hmm.
is these unrealistic expectations of perfection
Hmm. Yeah.
and shaming around the concept of mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Being
yeah,
be kind to yourself.
being kind to yourself is
Yeah.
radical.
I know.
It's
It's
right.
so
It
hard.
should not be. It shouldn't
No.
be. It should not be. We should
Hmm.
exist in a world in which being kind to yourself is a given. But
Hmm.
it is currently radical. And the
Yeah.
more that people do these radical things, the more normal they become.
Yes.
And that's a
Yeah.
good thing.
Yes. It's radicalized self-love. I love it.
Yeah.
Unradicalized, I should say. Um, Before we go,
Yeah.
could you share something about yourself that not a lot of people know that has nothing to do with your job?
Oh, I'm such an open book. I'm like wondering, what do most people not know? I can share. Okay, I can share a story of
Okay.
when I was a little girl.
Okay.
Uh, so when I was a little girl, I've always been a very spunky, service oriented, but like wants to explore, wants to challenge things kind of person. And so I've always been. I had to suppress it during chunks of time because it wasn't accepted, but that's who I've always been. And so I'm
Hmm.
remembering the story of my parents telling me that when I was 2 years old, they took me to Mexico to meet my grandparents, and they were amazed and scared at the same time that when they took me for a walk and it was out in the mountains somewhere, I insisted on not being carried, that I insisted on just running ahead because I wanted to exert my experience of independence in the world. And that was notable. I know that it's much more commonly seen now, which makes me extremely happy. Seeing well taken care of kids who are respected for their independence
Yeah.
is wonderful. But I grew up in a community that, as a woman, I was not only not allowed, I was shamed for those things.
Hmm.
So that's a story that I'm remembering.
I
Yeah.
love that. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for being a guest and sharing your wisdom and your experience and your story. I think it's so important to tell our stories so that people know that they're not alone and that they could really relate to us. Everybody, we're all connected. So
Yeah.
thank you for coming on. I really, really appreciate you.
Thank you. Likewise, Tina.